Well, good afternoon, everybody, from sunny Guangdong, but quite cool here. And we've got Jeff in Melbourne, and we've got Warwick in Brisbane, I think. I'm going to do a quick introduction to each of you. I know that Warwick is well known on my channel, but Jeff, you're not. So if I may, I'm going to read this so I get this right. I've got my line of sight is slightly off center here. So Jeff is an author of 3 books. Is that correct? 3 books. And countless government briefings. And as a brief career as a historian, he spent 33 years in government service and is so well-versed in how bureaucrats think, he even wrote the book on it. The book's called 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat. And you can find Jeff on YouTube. So there it is. I've put the link to your Substack, your YouTube, and your Amazon are all in the description. Now, just before I move on to Warwick, have I missed anything there?
No, that's pretty accurate, Jerry. And I guess I left government a couple of years ago after taking an early retirement package and have sort of transitioned into this life of writing and content creation. And appropriately for Jerry's Take On channel, I've got a picture of Mencius there on the cover of my book about bureaucracy and really like inside.
Yeah. Mencius is an interesting character. I find him more interesting than Confucius, actually, but that's another story for another day. Moving on to Warwick. Warwick is well known to my subscribers, but there may be a couple of people here who don't know who Warwick is. He's an adjunct professor in a university in Queensland. He's a senior fellow at the Tai He Institute, which is a very important Chinese institute. He's a businessman. He's a founder of businesses. He's a chairman. He's a director. And he's one of the busiest people that I know on social media. And I'm very, very grateful for Warwick for many different things, not least of which is putting Jeff and I together a few days ago when I saw a video. Somebody called Kevin Wayne, who's one of my subscribers, sent me this video, and it was a link to someone I've never seen before, Jeff Rich, talking about how to avoid World War III and pretty much how to do this by critical thinking. And I thought this is a great excuse for a video sometime before World War III starts, preferably. So we thought we'd better get on it quickly. But thank you very much for joining me, and welcome both of you to the show.
Thank you, Jerry. Lovely to be here.
Let's get straight on to this, and we'll have a little discussion about critical thinking, because both of you have got backgrounds in critical thinking. So, Jeff, you actually used to run courses, but now you have kind of guidelines online. Tell us a little bit about how that starts and what it's all about.
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, I used to be a government official, and I guess one of the things you need to be a good government official is to sort of know what you don't know, sort of thing, and to be able to appraise all sorts of different arguments from people with all sorts of interests and all sorts of passions, which both lead them in good directions and lead them in bad directions. And so I guess over the years I picked up a few skills with that. But I also, trained as a historian, did a PhD in history, and have studied history all my life. And in a way, history, I think, is also a great way to do critical thinking, or as I like to think of it, as imaginative empathy with others, and thinking about what other people's perspectives on issues might be. And the world's a terribly complex place, and our own stories tend to oversimplify things just a little bit, even in our own personal lives. So the sort of guides that I do on my Substack and to some degree also on my YouTube channel are really sort of, I guess, introductions to that sort of thinking, introductions to historians, to historical issues, to sort of current day world politics issues from a sort of historical perspective, and encouraging people to sort of think about the sort of narratives that people use that sort of structure the arguments that people use. Like we'll talk about, the various narratives that people use about China later in the show, but also to approach current world events with all the conflicts and all the partisanship and all the polarization and all the rest of it, all the propaganda, I guess, with an empathetic, open mind and open heart, so that we can see the different perspectives of different people around the world. Ultimately, towards this end of peace, I guess.
Sorry, what do you think people can learn if they come and, open-mindedly come and take a look at one of your Substacks about critical thinking? What's the most important thing to take away for them?
Well, I think the critical thing is we all get, the core of good history is good narratives, by which I mean complicated stories, complex stories that fit the reality of the world rather than, sort of Marvel franchise sort of stories, and also empathy. So realizing that everyone has a different perspective on the world and the sort of issues that we're confronting. So it sort of pays to actually ask what their different perspectives are and what is the real situation they're actually wrestling with. So I guess my guides are really about encouraging people not to get carried away with the common stories that you hear in the mainstream media or even in the alternative media. There are plenty of false stories, so to speak, or oversimplified stories in the alternative media as much as in the mainstream media about the big issues we confront. And to both use a empathetic approach to sort of realize what different people's perspectives are, but also sort of, I guess, a grounded analytical approach, especially with historical comparisons. There are historical comparisons all over the place about, what the post-1945 world is, or what the rise and fall, the American empire is like the late Roman Empire or the late British Empire or things like that. And it's really important, I think, when you do those historical comparisons to just take a mindful approach to it and look at, well, what's similar here and what's different here. And I think that really comes through when we look at particularly, say, US attitudes to China.
We're going to look at that a little deeper with the Thucydides trap, if I say that. I don't even know if I say that correctly, but I know that Graham Allison wrote a book about it, and you've kind of said, well, no, that's not going to work, but we'll come back to that later. Yeah. Warwick, you used to teach, I think it was in North Queensland, you used to teach a creative thinking course, right?
Yeah, I was asked to put together a program for a master's course on innovation, creativity, and leadership in the 21st century, which was really a great opportunity in many ways to pull together a bunch of things that I'd been thinking about for maybe 25 years, but which never had any real reason to pull together. Like Jeff, I had a period of time in the public service, and I also took a VER, voluntary early retirement. Except my VER was offered to me when I was 26, and I think I was
that's quite early.
I think I was the youngest person ever to be offered a VER. So my time as a public servant was short, but I also spent that time reading many reports and distilling and evaluating many documents and preparing briefs for the Premier of the day, where hundreds of pages had to be converted into 2-page briefs. So you sort of develop a way of seeing through the noise, if you will, and trying to figure out what the guts of a set of issues are, the make or break issues, the ones that will actually turn the question. Lots of detail, sure, but at the end of the day, what are the things that actually turn the question? Having only, of course, spent 5 years doing that, I didn't get to hone my skills in a way that Jeff no doubt did. And but yeah, look, this course that I put together and taught really tried to explore the question of what is it to think, and what does that actually mean in terms of being human and being creative. And so I was able to draw on my interests and a previous postgraduate life in in questions of epistemology and ontology, which is theories of knowledge and theories of reality, and explore through that the ways in which we can begin to be creative, and that meant, I guess, from my own perspective, an ability to think about the world in complex ways, that there was a necessity to understand the world as a holistic proposition, but at the same time be able to pull it apart. And that meant having to develop eclectic interests. The world is a complex place, and in a sense, viewed through different lenses, you'll see that the world reveals itself in different ways. And by developing an eclectic or a polymathic set of interests and a sensibility, you're able to firstly see the world reveal itself in many different ways. So I guess this is a parallel to Jeff's story about being empathetic, and in the process also be conceptually parsimonious, which is a fancy way of saying not be too caught up in too many dogmas or the cartoon strip versions of things. And when you do that, you can actually start to see ways in which things may or may not connect with each other, and may or may not help illuminate issues that one might have had in one particular field by thinking about it from a different point of view. So all of those things, I guess, have all contributed to an ability, I guess, to be a critical thinker. Whatever that, I guess, ultimately means. But
I'm not at all sure what that label, critical thinker, actually means. But I have an interesting thing happening to me on a daily basis because I live in China. I write about China, and most people outside of China will either do one of two things. They'll either say, "Oh, this is interesting because it's not how I view China," which is an acceptable point of view. Other people will say, "You're a liar," and well, I'm not, but we're never going to prove that to you unless you come to China and have a look for yourself. And then I get these people who live in China occasionally, or have lived in China, who say to me, "You're wrong because," and then they go on to list a different experience they've had. And I often say, well, look, I'm not going to argue with you because your experience guides your thinking. My experience guides my thinking. Now, I'm not sure that I can critically review what you say. I can understand why you don't like China. And I hope you can understand why I do, because it's just our different experiences. So is critical thinking really down to our different experiences, or is it more about our empathetic experiences where we understand others? Jeff, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's kind of the integration of both. In a way, it's a little bit of integrating left-hand side of the brain and right-hand side of the brain, to use that sort of old metaphor, which like the philosopher Ian McGilchrist has sort of, revived that metaphor with a lot of, science and philosophy, to really say that we do need the analytical part and the intuitive part as well. But the intuitive part is really, really critical. You really do need to, put yourself in other people's shoes to realize that we don't all see reality in the same way, and reality is complex enough for it to be seen in many different ways.
Yes.
And I guess one of my experiences in government is that you have to kind of find a way of working with and compromising with people who see the world in fundamentally different ways, but still need to make something happen in the world. Like, like doctors and nurses don't see health in the same point of view. They still have to work together to look after the patient. Students and teachers and parents don't see education from the same point of view, but you still need to work out some sort of compromise for them to, run a good school. Yeah. And I think in a way, I think that experience is very, has influenced me a lot in terms of the way I think about these sort of, big geopolitical issues, because, I think there's a little bit of truth in what most people say, and a little bit of error also in what most people say, and we need to sort of gently find our way through.
I've often said this of the BBC: there's about 2% truth and 98% misinformation or misinterpretation of that 2%. Warwick, this question, I'll pose this one to you and come back to you, Jeff. Does the weaponization of news media, and it has been weaponized, risk damaging the capability of the population to exercise critical thinking? Have we got diminished skills as a result of the mass media manipulation? This is something that is really, I think, close to your heart.
Well, look, the role of the media in shaping the views of populations has been subjected to, plenty of critical scholarly scrutiny over the last 70 to 80 years, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the mass media plays an incredibly powerful role in framing the dispositions of populations towards particular issues or problems of the day. And I say framing quite deliberately, because what tends to happen is that narrative frames are established which provide a mental map, if you will, of how the world is meant to fit together, and who is right and who is wrong, who is good and who is bad, and through those through that kind of conceptual compass, helps people who are not expert in things and who rely upon short snippets of information to ultimately reach a point of view. And the way in which the world is framed is actually the most critical issue in being able to deal with this question of critical thinking. So firstly, we need to recognize that the world is framed in the way that we approach it. And we are all creatures of framings. It is impossible for us as social creatures to not be enframed in one way or another, because we grow up within a social context. We have language, we have concepts, we have particular kinds of propositions that are normalized as part of our social existence. But in becoming aware of this enframing dynamic, it also helps us view that almost as if we can have an out of body or an out of frame experience. And whilst I think most of us tend to find comfort in the frames that we have grown up in and fall into the habits of conceptual routine roster, every now and then we snap out of that for all sorts of different reasons and realize that perhaps there are alternative frames. And some of those could be things that we are feeling in the dark towards, because something doesn't quite feel right about the narrative. So you have an inkling that the framing isn't giving you the story. You're not convinced by the framing. Alternatively, there are events that happen that fundamentally rock, your comfort in the framing that you've tended to bring to your understanding of the world. So much so that people can have very significant displacement experiences as a result of that, and where previously well-founded beliefs are turned on their head. Now, that's a very discomforting experience for many people, yes. But critical thinking, in a sense, could be a gentle pathway towards those kinds of experiences where you're firstly aware that the world is being framed, and in fact you are part of the framing as well. You can have these out of frame experiences and conceptually think about the framing itself, and through that process realize that there are other possibilities and that the world can therefore reveal itself to you in many other ways. And often we experience this, Jerry, as cross-cultural differences, or the differences of experiences that people have. Now, that drives you ultimately to also think long and hard about a number of pretty important things. One is the relationship between specific experiences and the generality of a claim. one is caused to also think about the relationship between the way we conceptualize systems, macro systems, and how they may or may not relate to dynamics of individual events. We also have to think about the modalities of proof. Different kinds of proofs seem to be more appropriate in different circumstances than others. And the ability to reflect upon which particular way in which we want to triage a set of claims or a body of information to arrive at a view that these claims or this body of information is sufficiently valid. Now, that's a skill in and of itself, to be able to figure out which modality of proof is the most appropriate one for that kind of claim. None of this is easy, which is why we often end up finding comfort in falling back into routine roster mental models.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to believe what you want to believe and then follow your echo chamber along that path. That's very easy.
Well, it's also a question then, why do you believe what you believe, right? And that's the hardest part. Taking that for granted is the easy part, because that's how we all are as we grow up. It's actually when you confront something that causes you to reflect on that fundamental question about the things that you once believed in or took for granted.
Yeah, that's true.
Those moments in life where reframings can happen.
Yeah, I've lived that. I've experienced that myself, arriving in China 20 years ago and finding this isn't what I thought it was. And it is an uncomfortable feeling to realize how wrong you have been and how misled you've been. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Jeff, about the same question applies here. You think the advent of social media, which is really only in the last maybe 20 years, and maybe a little more for some people, but for the general population, the last 20 years, is that helping or is that hindering? Because there's a lot of misinformation there, but you are a proponent of social media. You're on Substack, you're writing there, you're on YouTube, you're doing all of these things. So does social media help people, or does it hinder people in the process of establishing what's real and what's not in their world?
What a great question. I mean, I think it probably does both. I mean, it can play into all the cognitive weaknesses we all tend to have of believing the last thing we were told, or someone we trust, what someone we trust believes in, that sort of thing. But it has created this extraordinary environment where clapped out government officials like me with some knowledge to share can just sort of talk down a camera on YouTube and reach a global audience.
That's true.
and so it's I guess sort of lowered the barriers to entry, to use a sort of economic-y sort of term, to people sharing viewpoints, sharing things. And it certainly has, I guess within the Anglo-American world, does have a bit of an American bias and all that sort of thing. But nonetheless, on social media, I can get, Chinese viewpoints, Russian viewpoints, Iranian viewpoints. I can get global viewpoints. I can't get RT on YouTube anymore, but but I can just go somewhere else and get it anyhow. So it does create that broad environment. I mean, the other comment I had about this sort of weaponization of the media comment, I think that's a real issue. I'd describe it slightly differently to weaponization. It to me, and I've seen this really from the inside. To an extraordinary degree, a lot of the news you do see is carefully curated by combined efforts of government officials and journalists and media people. There is a managed narrative. There's a grid of events. There's a stage management of a whole series of things. At at times you almost get the sense that people are able to control the narrative, but not the reality, and so they focus on controlling the narrative. But I also think that has this kickback effect on people outside government, people outside politics, because if you like, politics gets disconnected from government of the the sort of media of politics gets disconnected from the reality of what is actually required to solve and coordinate and compromise on sort of social issues within a community. And so often what we discuss in media, both mainstream and independent, is politics as a kind of a puppet show, a Punch and Judy show of, good guys, bad guys, that sort of thing, rather than what the boring inside reality of what government is, which is complicated, slow, institutional solutions to very difficult problems. There's a famous comment from Václav Havel, who, famously wrote the essay about the power of the powerless, where he described the communist world of Czechoslovakia, and, where Gross would put up a sign saying, "Workers of the world unite," and the freedom that Grosser finds is by not repeating that slogan lie, to live in the truth, as he says. But he described politics, Václav Havel described politics as responsible concern for others. And I think so often when we treat politics as the Punch and Judy show of BRICS versus G7, or left versus right, or Trump versus whoever, we play into spectacle rather than sort of actually put ourselves in the shoes of, well, how are we actually going to come to a peaceful solution to these conflicts? Which is sort of, one of the things I do in one of my guides, my guide to geopolitics, is I invite people to imagine that they've just been appointed a foreign minister, and my guide is like, I pretend to be the government official who comes in with the briefing book, and it says, here's your first day briefing on the 7 top issues that you need to think about to do a responsible job as a foreign minister, because you can't just have opinions about things. You actually need to sense the reality of things, because in the end, the other side can say, no, we're not going to do that, and you're going to have to come up with a better solution. So you actually need to sort of pierce the narrative bubble and get into the sort of complex reality beneath it.
Right. So, Warwick, the onset of disinformation, obviously it's a negative thing. What's the future of this? Are we going to see social media overcoming the disinformation, or are we more likely to see social media following the path of disinformation?
Yeah, I think these are mainly symptoms of something broader that's happening, particularly in Western liberal societies, and that is the way in which information actually functions within these social systems. There is always going to be, various forms of informational inaccuracies, and that has forever been the case. So the issue isn't about misinformation, disinformation versus truth. The issue, I think, is really about understanding what is changing in terms of the relationships between truth claims and institutions and power. And by that, I mean, we need to think once again about what are the foundational ways in which societies come to accept that certain kinds of informational claims are valid and truthful. And I mean by that a sense of truth that really only has a small t rather than a capital T truth. And this is a question of social epistemology, how things become truthful within social settings. which are partly historical, right? And so we don't need to go down the rabbit burrow or the rabbit warren of concerns about post-truth worlds. What we actually need to understand is how truths get formed and are embedded within our systems of power and relationships and decisions that are made, and how that also falls apart. Mm-hmm. So we have all sorts of ways of having views about whether a particular informational claim is truthful and valid in the sense that I've just described. And that really relates to the kinds of claims that are being made. So claims that are being made about cosmic forces, for example, have very different sets of truth parameters and modes of proof than if you were making claims about some physiological feature of the world. And you would expect different kinds of agents to be in positions to make those claims and satisfy people that those claims are valid. It's when they start to blur that you start to have interesting effects. So when religious claims, for example, are remobilized and articulated into the world of politics, or are seeking to overturn well-established but clearly not permanent senses of truths in other domains, such as what we would call post-Enlightenment science, then societies experience significant conflict and discombobulation. And we saw that through the pandemic, for example, where we now have discussions about the status of science, the status of scientists, the status of scientism, as if that's a foundation of the way in which knowledge functions within our society, and how those forms of knowledge supposedly create stable forms of common knowledge upon which we can all conduct our business as individuals and as social entities, meaning that we have to interact with others in ways that actually assume that the bodies of knowledge that I work on are the same that you work on, and vice versa. So not only do we share a common knowledge, but there actually needs to be often one more thing, which is that you and I both know that we each other know this as well. And when that starts to fall apart, you get the kinds of fissures that are evident today, particularly in Western societies, around things like pandemics and disease, around, the role of, spirits in driving political forces or what have you. So, I think we've got to ask my own sense is that we've got to ask a different set of questions about the way in which social media and independent alternative media functions. It's not a question of somehow being able to find truth in one place and not in another. It's understanding why it is that the way that truth has functioned for the last, say, 200 years has come to a point in the earlier 21st century where it's falling apart. And what is it that we need to try to recover to give societies a solid foundation upon which we can actually go about doing things again, relying upon knowledges that others share.
Interesting. So Gary Black, or Gray Black, put that as a question up there, and it's taken us off in a different tangent. I'd like to come back to the purpose of our discussion today. So Jeff, you did an interesting video, which I've linked, and I found it fascinating because most people aren't aware of this. World War II didn't start when Germany invaded Poland. It didn't start when Japan invaded Pearl Harbor. It started in 1937. And actually, in my opinion, it started even 30 years before that, because Japan did invade part of China, which was occupied by Russia in a port that was named after a British person, Port Arthur. That, in my opinion, it all started back then. And that really was the catalyst for the two world, or as far as China was concerned, the two world wars. What motivated you to do that? And what was it that sort of said, there's something here missing that people don't know? So this is World War III didn't start in Germany, it started here. And you had a great little map showing where it started.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And the book is from this book here by Rana Mitter. I think you can see that. Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, 1937 to 1945. Oh, gee, I think to some degree the motivation was, I guess especially since the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine in 2022, people have been talking about World War III, about to start. And I've never really been a great reader of World War II history, for one reason or another. But, I know quite a bit about Russian history, so I was always aware of the fact that, the Russian experience of World War II was very, very different to the Anglo-American, like 1 in 7 people in the Soviet Union died. Yeah. Truly just astonishing proportion. So when all this sort of World War III talk broke out, I sort of went back and said, well, what's the story we're telling ourselves about kind of World War II, and how does that sort of fit into our sense of what the modern world is? Because in a way, I sometimes compare it to those sort of kind of war of the ancient myth that you sometimes get in computer games. It's where the sort of heroes and myths are sort of laid down. And I came across Rana Mitter's work, and I myself was just astonished to learn that, I knew about the Soviet Union's losses, but I just didn't know about the scale of involvement in China. I think it's variously between 10 and 14 million people died in the war between 37 and 45. And it actually becomes quite crucial to what we like to call the post-1945 world, the post-war world order, because the events in China, the role of China in amongst the wartime allies, and then the American loss of China as a reliable, pro-American state following the Chinese Revolution in 1949, really sets up the post-war world order in a way. It's not just about American democracy and the struggle with the Soviet Union. It's also very much about what is happening in Asia, and specifically China and Japan and the relative roles. So it was partly just my own discoveries about that sort of motivated me. And it sort of led to some reframing, and a bit along your lines, Jerry. The very, very distinguished military historian Richard Overy, or historian of war is perhaps a better way of describing him, published that book Blood and Ruins in 2022, I think, where it's a history of World War II, but he doesn't describe it as World War II. He describes it as the Great Imperial War, 1931 to 1945, and the 1931 date is the sort of Manchuria incident with Japan. Mm-hmm. And what becomes clear in that is the sort of very Western European, North American focus of so many of the stories, all of us have been exposed to since we were little kids watching television about World War II, dam busters and all that sort of
Bridge
stuff.
Too Far and all those,
the toy soldiers and all the rest of it, is extraordinarily distorted sense of it. And I think Richard Overy would probably agree with you, as with John Darwin, who's another historian of empires who I cover quite a bit on the YouTube channel and Substack, that there was this world crisis between roughly 1910 and 1942 that ultimately explodes in a multi-directional conflict between Germany, Italy, Japan, all of which were asserting their own sort of territorial imperial ambitions against the old European empires and the new American superpower. And of course, with the Soviet Union being a bit of a swing, a swing partner in all of that as well. So yeah, and if you have that sort of different story that you tell yourself about these critical foundational events, it totally flips your perspective on why China feels a certain way about, all those American bases that are still, bristling on China's doorstep nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, including in, the place that the nationalist leaders sort of withdrew to in Taiwan all these years later.
I just got told yesterday by someone, a friend of mine in Chinese media, we're not allowed to call it Taiwan anymore. We must call it Chinese Taiwan. Not we. We're not under those guidelines, but in China, in Chinese media, we'll no longer see the word Taiwan on its own. It's Chinese Taiwan. Just one more question, very quickly. Peter Frankopan you're a fan of his as well, I think. I don't know if many people realize who Peter Frankopan is. He's a British historian who has literally rewritten history and turned it on its side. We grew up with this Western perspective, Roman, Greek Empire, Egyptians, all that kind of history all around the Mediterranean. But in fact, there was a whole history that we kind of forgot to learn at school. And Peter Frankopan is, for me anyway, was the first one I read I don't know if you can identify others, but he was the first one I read who had actually said, hang on, we're looking at history the wrong way. It started in Africa, but it went to the East. It was in the East, and it was all trade with the East that kept North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and then the Ottoman empires, the Roman empires. That was how it all worked. So Peter Frankopan, I'll put his name into the description afterwards.
He writes some excellent books. He's got the Silk Roads and the New Silk Roads, which are kind of, I guess, the story of Eurasia and that sort of trade. And there are others. Like I spoke to a great historian on my channel, Marie Favreau, who's a French historian who wrote a book, The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World, which sort of emphasizes a totally different perspective on the Mongol Empire and its successor states, which you could almost see it as a kind of she describes it as like the Columbian Exchange. It's the sort of Mongol exchange. It actually links China to Europe, to North Africa.
I don't think a lot of people realize this, but Mongolians rode all the way to Poland.
That's right. So he's really good. Peter Frankopan's good, and Peter Frankopan's also recently written a book called I think it's called The Earth Transformed, which is a history of the planet, with a focus on climate change and
or ecology,
environmental type things. Like it looks at volcanoes and all that sort of stuff, which is again absolutely fascinating because it just gives you, it just totally changes your frame of reference about what's more important in the world. So there are a lot of great historians out there,
there are, and
people
and
should
some
really
of them
look out for. Some of them.
They're worth digging out. If you can send me the French guy's name, I'll put that into the description as well,
absolutely.
and I'll go looking for him as well. Warwick, I want to bring you back into the discussion because it's a round robin here. we've got a history with China America, China West, where we've gone through good times, bad times, great times, and now we're going through some fairly difficult times, troubled times, I think is perhaps the best way. What went wrong? What was the thing that we can say, well, there's a point that I mean, there may be not one point, but what went wrong? Why are we going from the post-Nixon era when things were going so well to today?
China defied America's expectations.
Oh, simple as that.
That's basically what went wrong from the point of view of the Americans. You've got to look at this again in the longue durée. So there's another historian for you, who spoke about the longue durée. You can look that up. And the longue durée, say over the last 200 odd years of American interactions with China, have largely involved, other than episodic moments where there was, a desire and a curiosity around things like porcelain and silk. There was some trade, of course, but by and large, from the mid 1800s onwards, there was a very distinct effort to civilize the barbarians of the Orient, and the Protestant missionaries began to fan their way through Asia. And by the 1880s, 1890s, there was tens of thousands of mainly American missionaries, though there were also some from Europe as well, whose purpose was to save the souls of the Chinese. And it did so both through direct proselytization as well as through the work of missionaries in the political processes of the Republican and post-Republican period of Chinese history. So during that period when millions of Chinese died, both in the domestic or civil war and then the war against the Japanese, the missionaries are also incredibly active in the political processes and had shaped a particularly strong discourse amongst the Republicans and the KMT around what a modern China may or should look like. And it had strong, missionary marks all over it. Now, Jeff mentioned this idea of the loss of China. This was actually a big deal. So, in 1945, when the Second World War ended, the Civil War in effect recommenced officially in China, and it took another 4 years and a half before the Civil War was officially over on the mainland, though I should say that the Civil War has never concluded. So the Civil War was officially over on the mainland when the People's Republic of China was established and declared, and it took a number of years thereafter before domestic affairs on the mainland became settled. Now, in that time, in the early 1950s, the big debate in the United States was over the question of who lost China. And McCarthy, in one of his very famous speeches, when he attacked the, Service, I think was the guy's name, in the State Department, for letting the communists influence the American State Department. I mean, the attack that was launched was not only about the insidious influence of the communists in the American State Department, but it was because of that America lost China. Right? So Chiang Kai-shek was seen by McCarthy to be fighting, quote, our war, right? Our war. And he made it actually very clear that it wasn't just a geopolitical war, it was a spiritual war. Because Chiang Kai-shek was a baptized Christian and was seen to be the front guy for a spiritual war that was being waged to eradicate the world of the ungodly communists. So the loss of China was not only a big geopolitical blow, it was a massive spiritual war blow. And I don't think the American body politic has actually ever recovered from that. And now, come the early 1970s and eventually into 1979 with the formal recognition of the PRC by the United States, that was driven by temporary geopolitical considerations. But let's not be confused with the idea that the period 1980 through to say 2010 was somehow other than anything but an interregnum. The Americans believed that if they couldn't save China's souls and eradicate the godless communists through spiritual warfare, through the work of missionaries, then they'd do it through the work of the market, right? So the religion of neoliberalism was mobilized as a way of transforming China. This was Clinton's argument in the mid-1990s when he had his own domestic opponents who opposed Clinton's proposition that China be admitted to the WTO.
Yeah.
And this, by the way, it included folk like Robert Kagan, who were vocal opponents of Clinton's argument in the 1990s. Kagan, of course, now is saying, "I told you so." But Clinton's argument and those around Clinton was basically, look, if we liberalize China and roped it into American global capitalism, then China itself must change, and it must change in a particular way. So modernization and development theory at the time, the Washington Consensus, etc., all led to the belief that market reforms, and they did this with the Soviet Union too, by the way, would drive political liberalization. And this is where China defied the Americans. So come 2018, we had a special issue in Foreign Affairs magazine, which asked the question, was all these years of engagement worthwhile? And the conclusion, in effect, was, no, it wasn't. It wasn't worthwhile at all. Why? Because China did not change to become mini-me. That's why it wasn't worthwhile. The spiritual war failed, and because it failed through the magic of the market, the American body politic has reverted back to form, which is to pursue it through military and proselytizing means. And here we are.
So we've had a religious attempt to change China, an economic attempt to change China, and now we need an invasion effectively to change China. Why can't, you're a historian, Jeff, why can't America just say, China is China, let's leave them as they are and work with that? What's so wrong with doing that?
Well, I think there's two fundamental forces of inertia within the American leadership culture that, keep them in this sort of position. One is just the military strategic reality of the continuing, what the historian John Darwin describes as the partition of Eurasia that happened after 1945 in Europe. The what's it called, the Iron Curtain goes up. But in East Asia, America loses China, but then it gains Japan, and the original American plan was to have its base in China and have Japan a subordinated military colony kind of thing,
as it is now.
But it has been a very economically successful subordinated colony that America has taken action against. So in Korea, that division is still there, Taiwan to some degree, the Philippines. So John Darwin says there's this unique historical circumstance where a non-Eurasian power establishes itself at both ends of the Eurasian continent after 1945. And in the Cold War, the end of the Cold War saw the end of the partition in Europe, but it didn't see the end of the partition in Asia. And so that unresolved issue, I guess, remains to be resolved. And I think, it's just screaming at the world to say, how much longer can this continue? And then I guess there is this continuing, the belief in American hegemony, American primacy. The historian Adam Tooze, who's a brilliant economist and economic historian, really says the whole idea of world hegemony is something that it has only ever been possible in the unique historical conditions in the 20th century that for a while the United States enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
Yet it still clings to that idea that, it can sort of rule the world from the Situation Room of the White House. And this has a complete grip on American geostrategy, Brzezinski, Mackinder, Jake Sullivan. They all basically espouse the idea of, dominating the world by dominating Eurasia.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I just think they're psychologically and culturally resistant to allowing themselves to be one among many nations. And it's interesting that you mentioned the whole, Kissinger, Nixon goes to China sort of thing, because Nixon was a rare American president who came at a moment when the perception in China and to some degree in the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union was rising and the United States was declining and struggling. And Nixon also was, partly because of his temperament, partly because of his political insight, skeptical of America's ability to be, the sole superpower. And he saw America's future as being, more one among many, that he could relinquish the idea of it being the indispensable nation. And it was for that reason that he pushed détente with the Soviet Union, and he pushed the opening with China. And it, probably didn't really develop ultimately in the way anyone really planned. But the actual story is really quite different to the way, I guess, Henry Kissinger has been relaying the story, or was relaying the story for how many years was it? 50 years. When Kissinger went to Beijing, he was Nixon wasn't terribly convinced that he was, capable of doing the negotiation. He spoke to Zhou Enlai and nervously read off his sort of briefing paper, which any bureaucrat would tell you is a sign that the guy's not quite in control of himself. And Zhou Enlai sort of turned to him and said, it's all very well, but unless the United States accepts the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China, and at this point in 1971 or whatever it was, the United States still had not accepted, had not recognized China. Taiwan was sitting there in the United Nations Security Council, representing a tiny proportion of China. And he said, unless you recognize the equality and sovereignty of the People's Republic, the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China, we just can't go anywhere. And that means, leaving Taiwan, accepting that Taiwan's part of China. And Zhou Enlai said to him, it would be like we refuse to accept the legitimacy of the United States occupation of Hawaii. And he said this, like 15 to 20 years after Hawaii became a state of the United States. Or even Long Island, the island off the coast of New York, not so different to the location of Taiwan. So the story of the opening to China was sort of, I think, very different. And it it was created by that perhaps rare moment of both circumstance and character that meant for a while America could say, we don't have to dominate the world to live in the world.
Yeah.
And I think unless that sort of really shifts, then we'll be stuck in this conflict for quite a while.
That's an interesting point, because I've written another question here, and I'm going to pose this one to Warwick. Do you think, and I'm slightly rewording this question, can Trump pull the rabbit out of the hat and do something different? Is Trump, for all of his buffoonery, I think that's the best word I can use to describe him, he's certainly playing to a crowd, but is he another Nixon who recognizes the differences between hegemony and being one of a crowd? Can Trump do it?
Oh, look, I don't know whether he can or he can't, but it's funny you asked that, because literally this afternoon I finished off an essay for one of the publications that I frequently publish in, and well, hopefully it'll come out in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And I guess the essay posed the question of, firstly, Trump's posture towards the problems in Ukraine and what that might mean in a broader sense. Now, the situation in Ukraine, of course, is at the western end of Eurasia, right? And he promised during the election campaign that he would have it fixed in 24 hours. Now,
Yep.
Put aside election campaign hyperbole, it did raise, of course, some significant expectations that Trump was going to be focused on some kind of a peace settlement. So the question now turns to the mechanics themselves, right? So it's one thing to say that you have an aspiration for an outcome, but how do you actually materialize that? And we've seen over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks a bunch of folk in Europe and also in the US float a swag of ideas about what a potential peace or ceasefire come peace arrangement proposal could look like. None of which, incidentally, I think will fly. But they essentially range from, freezing of the conflict lines to enable negotiations to take place, some kind of a ceasefire, to various debates about concessions of territory for peace, etc., etc. Now, the reason why I don't think any of those things will fly is that they actually don't hit the critical issues that underpinned this conflict to start with, and which actually have been articulated by the Russians for quite some time. And that is the general security architecture of Europe, or should we say, of the western end of Eurasia. And so the Russians are now in a position where, over the course of the past few weeks, you will have seen Sergei Lavrov, for instance, only a couple of days ago, together with Putin himself, as well as some of the more hardliners in Moscow, talk a lot more directly about the needs of Russian security interests to be properly taken into account. And this winds us back then to the proposals that were advanced by the Russians in late 2021, which was for a treaty between Russia and the United States and for a peace agreement between NATO and Russia. Now, I think all of those are going to be back on the table, because Trump's problem is if he goes to Russia with a mediocre transactionally based proposition around some kind of a freeze and maybe some offers of lifting some economic sanctions, Russia's not going to buy into it anymore. They've been burned by the experiences of both the Minsk agreements and also the Istanbul peace processes. And so they're not going to buy into it. They're in a strong position militarily on the ground. I think they're in a strong position globally in terms of the way that they've handled their broad network of diplomatic engagements, given that they were the ones who invaded Ukraine. And so Russia is in a position to actually push quite hard back on transactionally driven propositions, which means Trump has got to pull a rabbit out of the hat. And maybe circumstances bring forth the statesman. And the circumstances, of course, demand a statesman that says, you know what, the war is lost. We need to build a new peace. And a new peace means taking into account the interests of 140 million people and the reality that Russia's not going to go away. Now, the reason why this matters more broadly is not only the prospects of it being a rabbit out of the hat at the western end of Eurasia, it also creates a dynamic that perhaps also opens up the Pandora's box of what happens at the eastern end of Eurasia. And that's because we've got two things that already connect this. And I don't just mean geography, I mean a confluence of political dynamic. One is that when Putin visited North Korea and Vietnam earlier this year, he explicitly talked about the extension of a new security architecture into Asia, number one. But number two, I noticed that this point has never been covered in any mainstream Western media. In July this year, he and Xi Jinping actually agreed on the principles of a security club, which covers Eurasia in its entirety at a very, very high level. Now, these alignments of political forces, together with the circumstances of Trump, creates a window of opportunity for Trump, the statesman, to emerge. Is that possible or not? Hey, I don't know. Time will tell. But if Trump is to make a mark, he will need to do better than offer a few transactional sinecures to try to persuade the Russians to discontinue their march westward to the Dnieper and ultimately beyond the Dnieper into Odessa and those sorts of areas. He will need to bring his grand paradigmatic strategic game to the table. And if he does that, he will need to stare down European and domestic critics who will be absolutely apoplectic at the prospects of concessions to Russia. But the reality is that Biden will be blamed for losing the war. Brussels will be blamed for losing the war. Zelensky will be blamed for losing the war. And Trump has a window, if he can act quickly, to be the statesman that perhaps Nixon was in the early 1970s.
Very interesting perspective. Very interesting. I've got this kind of 80-20 view on Trump. 80% he's going to ruin America and 20% he can do something different. And you seem to have a similar sort of thing. He could if he just does, but let's see what he does.
I don't know, right? Look, I know plenty of Trump supporters and Trump haters. And they're very partisan in their investments into Trump as an individual and what he stands for and all those things. And I simply say to them both, look, I don't know. How does anyone know, right?
No, we don't.
Only time will tell. But this seems to me to be the landscape that we are now operating in. This seems to me that this is, if it is true that, Trump, really, well, Trump needs to desperately wipe his hands of the mess, number one, because the longer he delays it, the more he also owns the mess.
Yeah.
Right. That's the politics of it, the optics. So he's got to solve it quickly. Otherwise, it becomes his mess too. So that's the first problem he's got. It's a timing problem, and he doesn't have a lot of options available. He can't play small cards on this. He's got to solve it quick and big, which means he's got some big fights to deal with across the Atlantic. Arguably not that hard, because frankly, I don't think the Europeans are a match for Trump and the United States, but he's got Congress to deal with, and that's going to be a problem. Right?
Yeah.
So this is where he's got to be. But he's got to take a view that is not only a resolution of the western end of Eurasia, but that in fact, if that begins to look like it's going to head somewhere towards a resolution, it will open up the need to resolve the eastern end of Eurasia as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've got the Eurasian Economic Union doing great things. But let's move on from that, because segueing from that, and there is a good segue here, there's a thought that if they can fix the Russian-Ukrainian issue, then they can focus on China. And he's just introduced one of your favorite people, Warwick, Elbridge Colby, into his administration, who is a huge proponent of doing exactly that. Russia's not our enemy, China is. Let's focus on that. And then we've got another of your pet projects, Jeff, which was the refuting of Graham Allison on the Thucydides trap. You and I have a huge amount of agreement on a lot of things that I don't know. My background is in cross-cultural change management, or certainly the last 10 years has been focused on that. What that did when I started looking at that cross-cultural change management aspects of things, I found that Chinese people with the same set of stimuli do not do the same things as Western people. And when Western people look at something and they say, well, this is what we would do under these circumstances, so clearly this is what China is going to do. Is that how you see how they've got that so wrong? Or is there something different?
I think that is part of it in a way, isn't it? It's like there's the realist school in international relations that believes that there's some sort of real national interest that realistic people like themselves realistically can discern, and people act in a realistic manner and are never affected by emotions or misconceptions or anything else. And I think in a way that is part of the problem with so much American sort of strategy. It is based on this sort of constructed concept of a strategic game in international relations between hegemon and challenger, in which it's a kind of, a fight to the death using all resources possible, full spectrum dominance, and they're not attuned to different ways of managing international relations based in different cultural conceptions, based in different political traditions, based in different historical experiences, like the historical experience of losing 27 million people through a war, or 14 million people during World War II is very different to the United States. So I see the Thucydides trap from Graham Allison as, in a way, a sort of a dressing up with a little bit of classical learning, the same sort of story of challenger and hegemon, because the Thucydides trap is the idea that was expressed by the Greek historian, who happened to be a failed American general, a failed Greek general, Athenian general, that a rival power and a dominant power and a rising power will come to blows in war, because the dominant power fears the rise of the new power, and that sort of war is inevitable. And that concept is the same basic idea that informs sort of John Mearsheimer's sort of vision of international relations, why he thinks ultimately China will behave like the United States, rather than sort of look at what its specific historical experience, its specific cultural mindset, its specific political traditions really are. And so I do think in a way it is sort of partly about a cultural thing, but it's a kind of it's a way in which America tends to just blind itself to blind itself to different possibilities of conducting international relations. And that's, on the Trump question, I feel very skeptical of his capacity to pull a rabbit out of a hat, because, he's no Nixon. If past performance is the best guide to future performance, Trump's capacity to mobilize political institutions, political elites, political beliefs in the country, his capacity is good doing stump speeches, but his capacity to actually mobilize people towards specific strategic aims in foreign policy or diplomacy is dreadful. So whatever his intentions are, I doubt he has the capacity to execute. And everything I've seen about his intentions are he's just a different version of American primacy. You know, he's just a bit of a more sort of uncouth, blustery, heavy-handed.
I think he's more honest about
American primacy.
it,
Yeah, well, he's going to just seize the Panama Canal and
he's
make
just more honest
Canada a 51st state. But I thought Australia was already the 51st state.
Yeah, you can't have Canada
as
the
52nd or maybe 52nd, because there's 6 or so provinces in Canada, aren't there? So
there's going to be a few. I've got a Canadian friend here, and I mentioned that to him. He was here on Christmas Day, and I mentioned that to him. I said, "Have you seen that news?" He said, "It'll be over a lot of dead bodies that happens." But it looks like Trump wants that. But Warwick, what do you think? I think we all agree that Trump doesn't have the gravitas to motivate the support that he needs. I mean, he's certainly got the bluster, but he doesn't have the gravitas. But normally when someone comes to power like that, they would normally have a little more gravitas rather than bluster, but they would then surround themselves with people who could help them achieve their goals. What do you reckon about the administration? I mean, we're talking about China here particularly, but the administration that he's surrounding himself with, what do you reckon? Is it going to be good for China or good for world relations?
Well, time will tell, right? That's my standard response when the question's too hard. And in part, though, the reason why time will tell is because circumstances can shape things in ways that are far more powerful than a handful of individuals can. And circumstances can also call forth certain modes of behavior that we would least expect from particular individuals. And so let's be patient on that. And I guess this brings back to this issue, which I think you'll find in Graham Allison's work as well as in the realist sort of tradition, which is a real tension between this conceptual idea that there are these structurally given forces at work, as well as at the same time some kind of a concession towards some notion of agency. And so you'll find in the Thucydides trap argument that, rising power, declining power, conflict. And yet, of course, it misses the actual historical lesson itself of the conflict upon which the theory was based, and that is that there was concrete efforts made to avoid war through diplomacy and statecraft. And in fact, when you advance a theory about something and you identify a number of cases that disprove your theory, a certain mode of social inquiry would suggest that that theory has been adequately falsified, and you move on. Right? The fact that it had a catchy title and got published at the right moment in time allowed a dubious, ahistorical theory to dominate thinking. Right? So let's just move on from what has been a totally unhelpful, both historically and conceptually, piece of American B-grade political science. The issue about the realists, though, is that the realists themselves also have problems. So this goes back to this issue of conceptual frames. The realists really ground their entire understanding of the world on the idea that there are interests which are given externally to nations. They are given, and that it is up to nations to rationally recognize those interests and pursue those. And it is based on this rational interests model that really became very popular in the social sciences in the 1980s and 1990s. And you'll find that in just about every other field of social scientific inquiry that the presuppositions of rational interests got ditched. Because in the end, it didn't really help explain very much at all. And so, in fact, you'll find it again that the rational choice models that underpin realism, in presupposing this idea that there are interests that are given externally to the agents, can't cope with the idea of agency that they themselves introduce into their models. So we have, for instance, in the Mearsheimer stuff, a recognition that American decision-making vis-a-vis Israel is, in Mearsheimer's own terms, irrational. And he and his colleague Stephen Walt wrote a book explaining why, in fact, that's the case. Now, the minute you accept the validity of that argument, it actually means that the rest of the argument on realist terms has to be heavily qualified at best. The other problem that it has is that it actually doesn't understand or can't come to grips with the possibilities that nations have different ways of framing not only their views of the world, but also their understanding of how the world works. And this is where I think Jeff was definitely getting to. Now, if other actors within a particular environment don't behave the way that this theory assumes that they should, then it means that the theory can't work either, because the theory no longer represents what's going on in the world. So in part, it's an attempt to be predictive. This is how the world is. In part, it attempts to be a normative framework. This is how the world should be. But in fact, it doesn't succeed on either of those grounds, right? And it's because it's trying to be both. You actually need a much more constructivist view of how nations understand themselves and others in the world to actually grasp the nuances of the ways in which nations even contemplate this idea of national interest, right? So, you know, if, for sake of argument, a country has a view that its national interests is defined by the pursuit of prosperity and peace, and that both of those are to be achieved together because prosperity depends on peace and peace is grounded on prosperity, then you don't get the behavioral norms that you would otherwise expect from a theory that says the nation must assert its dominance. Right? Now, there's no reason why the first set of interests and the means-end relationship aren't rational. Right? They're entirely rational. Right? And they don't just go to prosperity and peace. They actually go to the core of the realist foundation, which is survival. Because with prosperity and peace, you have survival.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And instead of seeing these as pitched against each other, survival or prosperity, they are reframed as intimately, symbiotically interrelated. China does that.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've always said about I've never read the Thucydides trap, but the point that I make about the theory is that in order for this to happen, you need to have a challenger. And China has, throughout its 75 years of its modern history, has always said it's not looking to be prime. It's not looking for hegemony. It's not looking to overtake the US. And it will accept if it does do, but it's not challenging to do that. It is simply going along its own way, investing in itself. Yes, it's seeking soft power elsewhere, but that soft power is only so it can keep up with its own growth. And it needs to do that, as any country does, to keep their economy growing stronger. They need to diversify, etc. So I don't think China is really the challenge that America think that it is. That's the big problem that the West have got. They say, China is threatening us. And I say, well, what was the threat? Where is the threat? Oh, look at the size of them. Well, yeah, they're big, but so are America. Look at their military expansion. Well, that's defensive. And look at how many guns are pointing at them from 800 different military bases, particularly around the Pacific region and the three chain defensive ring. They've got a defense. America has a defensive ring of weapons around China. That's not defensive anymore. So China has its rights to protect itself.
Look, there's a few ways to understand this issue of threat, right?
Yep.
And this is where I think a bit of critical thinking can help us delve into a little bit more. Because I can run the alternative argument, which says, look, China says it's not a threat, but you can't believe that. Okay. because if it is wanting to be a threat, the last thing it's going to do is announce the fact that it's a threat. Right? So that in and of itself doesn't guarantee that my concerns about something being a threat isn't a threat at all. The other issue is I think you can then start to say, well, in what ways does it actually pose itself as a threat, even putting aside intentions? Well, is it in a position to threaten the physical or territorial security of the American homeland? And there is no way that there is anybody, a reasonable analyst would say that China is capable of doing that. Incidentally, it's the same argument for Australia. Is there anything about China that can reasonably be said to threaten the American way of life? I doubt it. The only thing I think it would probably threaten, and in fact it's largely failed to do it, is to introduce a decent palette of flavors to the American cuisine. But it's hardly a threat to the American way of life.
I think that's probably a lost cause, Warwick, but
point taken. And so the last question then comes to, well, is it a threat to America's economic well-being? Okay, so you start to break down these dimensions of threat and risk and whatever else. Well, well, in some ways it is, but how is it? It's not a threat by wanting to come up and tackle America on a one-to-one basis. The reason why it's a threat to America's economic well-being is because it is fundamentally part of the changes to the global economic system that is overturning the foundations upon which America built its wealth and power. So it's a systemic change. China itself isn't threatening America economically, but China itself is part of a system change that is undermining the historic foundations of American economic prowess and dominance. Does that mean, however, that America is a declining power? Does it mean that American living standards, for example, need necessarily decline as a consequence? Well, that's a public policy problem. It's how do you deal with the changes in the world, as opposed to simply saying, my goodness, the system that we depend upon is changing. We must stop the system from changing, because you're not going to stop the system from changing.
It's interesting.
So does China pose a threat? Certainly not in the way that America would a priori view this question of threat, which is someone's going to muscle up and come up to me and say, I'm going to knock you off and all that sort of stuff. Far from it. What's happening is that the world's changing.
Yeah.
Right. But there's no threat to America's way of life. There's certainly no capacity to be a military threat to the American homeland. And the economic system is changing, which requires adaptation. It's not a threat. It's a challenge to adapt to.
Yeah. Well, again, that's another of my pet theories. In the cross-cultural change management, the change management part of it is equally as important as the cross-cultural part of it. Yeah. You need to understand change and how it happens. We've come to the 90-minute mark almost, and I just wanted to give each of you a chance to wrap up. So, because I try not to keep these too long, over 90 minutes, although sometimes they have done. Warwick and I were guilty of that once. I think we got 3 hours one time.
Never again. Never again.
Never again. I think it took you to 1 o'clock in the morning that day. But let's just have a final wrap up, Jeff. First of all, I want to thank you for your taking your time. It's a Saturday afternoon or evening now, and thank you very much for joining us. But do you have any parting thoughts about the relationship between China and America and what we can do to prevent World War III?
Well, I do think that what Warwick said about the change position of Russia and China about the Eurasian security sort of setup kind of thing is very important. And I think there was a comment, I can't quite remember who said it, but basically it was Eurasia will establish its own collective security arrangement without external powers, and that means without the United States of America. And one way or the other, that is going to happen because the forces for change have just sort of, left behind the post-1945 world, the role of America, the strength of China, the scale of industrial production in China, the scale of scientific and technological, production creativity in China is just totally different to what the mental landscape of American elites is. And at some point or other, there'll have to be an adaptation, and I think that's really, really crucial. So I think we just need to all sort of learn to live with a world that is more evenly balanced, more culturally diverse, more politically diverse, and where a lot of the forces for change that we've come to know as globalization is no longer Westernization. It's sort of coming from other parts of the world. People are being influenced by what's happening in China, by what's happening in India, by what's happening in Russia, and all the rest of it. And that's just a total flip on the sort of mindset of what the post-1945 world is. And so just to come back to my guides on my Substack, I recently did a guide to the post-1945 world that sort of looked at all these fundamental changes and, how they sort of set up the system that we're living in today. So viewers might want to check that out at the links that you provided in the video description.
Yeah, I've put, someone's just asked me where you are on X and all the links to find you. Are you actually on X?
Yeah, but I'm a bit of an erratic X user because I don't know. I find it.
I find X is getting a little harder to enjoy. But all the links that I found for you are on the description.
Yes.
Okay. Warwick, any final parting thoughts on how to avoid World War III?
Well, I'm actually going to firstly give a plug to Jeff's Substack and channel as well. I don't necessarily watch it religiously, so that's a confession, Jeff. But I'll revisit this problem on New Year's Eve and perhaps amend my ways. But Jeff has covered through his review of Darwin's books, I think, some fantastic history, and together also with a French author who you've kindly, for the sake of your viewers and listeners, in effect translated his work. And I think that there's something incredibly valuable in that. So part of this issue of critical thinking is to get to know stuff, right? Just get to know things, learn about things, and whenever you learn new things, be grateful that you've learned something new, and sock that away and have that in your little kit bag to help you think about the world. So what Jeff has done, and also what Jerry does, I think is fantastic. Look, I think the challenges of peace actually go beyond the avoidance of war, and we need to work on a couple of things. One is obviously the avoidance of war as a first step, because without that, we don't get to worry about the rest. Mm-hmm. And the concerns that I have is that the United States actually is the one country that has demonstrated for the best part of the last 7 decades a predilection to kinetic first as a foreign policy approach, rather than diplomacy and negotiation first. And without some fundamental changes in the ways in which the United States elite think about itself and its place in the world, we are going to sit on the precipice of some, fairly dangerous times for the foreseeable future. What gives me some hope, of course, is that the United States does not get to operate in a vacuum, and there are many things going on in the world that will also shape the ways in which the elite in the United States, and there are competing views amongst the elite to some extent, though the degree to which they are different, I guess, is debatable, but which may cause a much deeper reflection over the next 4 years and perhaps a little bit longer about the changes in the world and how the United States adjusts to what is currently a very deep sense of displacement anxiety. So what does that mean for everyone else? Well, of course, it means that from time to time, many people will be sitting on the edges of their seats worried about kinetic first as a response. But I also think that major countries around the world understand a need to be incredibly patient during this period of transition and change, and accept that those who are most displaced by change are likely to potentially lash out more so than anyone else. And my last reflection in terms of the issue of both avoiding war and ultimately in terms of building the peace is to reflect a little bit on John Maynard Keynes's work, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, because in that work he looked at the problems of the Versailles treaties that ultimately laid the groundwork for a radicalization of the German body politic. And it did so in part because it imposed economic costs on Germany that Germany couldn't handle, and ultimately humiliated Germany as a nation, as a people, and as a civilization. The lesson to be learned in the transitions in a world where the hegemon is progressively experiencing a reality that it's no longer the hegemon is for everyone else to learn the lessons of Versailles and focus on how a peace can be built that doesn't focus upon retribution, but which focuses upon the possibilities of creating prosperity and peace as symbiotic codependence. So they're my thoughts for 2024.
Interesting. Basically, we need to learn from the lessons of history, and finishing 2024 with a historian. And I'm not sure what you describe yourself as, Warwick. You're on the edge of digitalization. How do you describe yourself in one word? Academic.
I don't know. I'm much more polymathic these days than particularly hemmed by any disciplinary approach. But my background was in political economy and political theory. But these days, of course, so long as you can think, I think, so long as you can think, and bring on board, the perspectives of different levels of expertise and kinds of expertises, and perhaps also synthesize these things into a way of understanding the world. I mean, that's and be open to modifying that synthesis.
Okay, so an historian and a polymath. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining, and also to the more than 100 people who came in. Thank you very much for joining. Trevor Norman, thank you for the donation as well. But let's call it a day there, and I wish everybody a happy new year for 2025. Thanks very much, and thank you guys for joining.